Alrighty. Welcome to Roundtable Decision, and I am your host, Wyatt Birkenoff. And today's episode is going to be a little different. I wouldn't say that I've done a ton of research on this topic that I kind of going to have as the main one about who's going to be Joe Biden's vice president. But I wanted to wanted to start with a topic a little bit different, and then we'll dive into the main ones just to let people kind of accumulate in the chat and get to ask questions. This is going to be a little more open of a stream that I don't really have as structured as much as the past. But I was going to start with something a little bit different, as I've kind of already said. Those of you who have been on Earth and been alive for the past probably month and a half know about Tiger King and the influence it's had on the world. And I have watched every episode of Tiger King. Not that that's a proud thing to say, but it's just a fact. I've done it. I was born and I did it. But I was recently watching an episode of the Slash Filmcast, and those who don't know about the Slash Filmcast and what the Slash Filmcast is and what they are, or I should say, however you want to say it, they're essentially a group of guys that review movies. And I've listened to them a lot because I'm a big movie fan, and I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily good at breaking down film like some YouTubers are about movies, but I'm just a movie fan in general and enjoy watching movies, obviously. And I'm a big podcast person. I tend to watch podcasts or listen to talk radio more than listening to music. So that's kind of weird and something that makes... Yeah, something that's a little weird, especially for my age group, but it's just something I do. And I've always listened to the Slash Filmcast and all the reviews, and in general, I tend to agree with their opinion, but there's a lot of times that I don't agree with their opinion. And that brings me to the point of my first topic for this live stream, and that was their episode on Tiger King. And those who haven't listened to Slash Filmcast before, what they tend to do is they tend to talk about like what they've been watching or just things that happened in their life that were funny or something that they think is interesting that has happened. And in the case of Tiger King, they did the same thing, but I've always skipped ahead to the future review. So in the future review, they were starting to talk about Tiger King. And I've seen it before, so I'm like, you know what? It's not something I typically are going to listen to a review about, because it's not something that really interests me to listen to. But I'm like, you know what? I'll have to see what they have to say about Tiger King. So I decided that I was going to listen to it, and I did. But I almost disagreed with every point they had about their Tiger King episode, and I'll dive in a little bit as to why. But I see a comment here, as Ed says, have to turn the podcast off once in a while. Yeah, that's the same thing with me, especially now that, because a lot of times I listen to like political type of podcasts, they either tend to repeat themselves a lot, or it just gets tiring hearing the same thing over and over and over again. Like, I'm not a huge Ben Shapiro fan, not to get off on too much of a side note, but Ben Shapiro loves to repeat himself episode after episode after episode after episode. So it's something that's rather boring to me after a while. So I'll go in phases of listening to podcasts like his and other podcasts. But yeah, podcasts can get very tiring, even though it's something you typically do for enjoyment, which is a little interesting. But as for the main first point with Tiger King, I almost disagreed with everything they said about Tiger King and their stance on it. There's a couple things I did agree with, and I figured I would kind of start with what I did agree with. They mentioned the fact about the documentary makers of this episode, because what it seemed like from the documentary and what I've read about afterwards from websites that have kind of talked about it and journalists that have talked about it, was they weren't exactly fair in how they approached the documentary. It seemed like they first were going to start the documentary to talk about the captivity of these exotic animals and the reasons it's good and the reasons it's bad, and kind of had a different perspective, a perspective of the Tiger King, or Joe Exotic, who did cub petting and other things that many would consider bad. And then the perspective of someone like Carol Baskins, who was someone who did rescues of tigers, or claimed they did rescue of tigers, and did it for more of a moral good reason instead of just the dollar signs and the money behind the keeping tigers captive. But there was a lot of things I didn't agree with, and you could say that that was the only thing I really did agree with what they said about Tiger King. So the problem about the review was that it leaned on political, and although Tiger King issued some on political stances, Joe Exotic did run for government and ran for president/governor during the course of the episodes and during the course of what happened, but that wasn't exactly something he took super seriously, as his campaign manager in one of the episodes said, and as even Joe Exotic really said, because all Joe really wanted to do was get popular. But they were taking it more of as a stance. They thought the documentary was kind of talking about why America is so bad, why capitalism is bad. Several times, one of the hosts of the podcast mentioned about how capitalism and how Tiger King shows the greediness of it and why it's bad and why it needs to change. And although that opinion is valid, it's free speech, it's something that I greatly believe in, and it's something he has a right to say, it's something I disagree with in almost every way. Although you could say what Joe was doing was bad, it's not bad form of capitalism. He saw the advantage and he took advantage of the advantage, and what he did was not illegal unless he killed those tigers that the episode claimed he did, and that many workers claimed he did as well. As Ed says, when I used to work in Madison, I would listen to Hannity on the way to work. I was second shift. He went on the same rant every day, and it always hit the same place on the trip. Yeah, a lot of those episodes seem very, very scripted, because obviously you're only going to have so much to really say in a day or about a topic, and they have to be able to say something about it. There's nothing worse than radio silence. Although podcasts aren't necessarily radio silence, they can still be, it's still the same sort of concept. You don't want blank space because they're not necessarily edited. Now, podcasts can be edited, but a lot of those shows like his and others tend to not be as edited as other type of podcasts. But like, I listen to all the time talk radio, and I used to listen to the political kind of conservative station, and I listened to a liberal one just to get both perspectives. But the conservative station tend to do it more often, and that was they would just pick a point and they would discuss it at the same time. And I didn't notice if it was the same time of the day like Hannity, but a lot of times I would notice that they would be saying the same things. And obviously they're going to have their same sort of opinions, as I've kind of already said, but it just is very, very annoying and very repetitive when you hear the same thing over and over. It's like they don't really change that much, and they don't feel like they have to change because what they say is valid. Like, I used to like Sebastian Gorka, who was on the station, and I believe his studio's even in Houston, which is near where I live. But he would go talking about the same sort of things about Trump. Like during the time where he met with Kim Jong-un over the border, and he stepped across and all that, he was talking about how it was so good, and I agreed with him, but he just kept saying the same thing. And then I would tune on the day after the college class, and he would be saying the same thing, and then the day after that it was the same thing. And then I started listening to Larry Elder, who tends to be a little bit different, but I listened to him a little bit longer than I listened to Gorka, but then I noticed that he was saying the same things over and over and over again. So it's just kind of annoying that can happen, but it also makes some sense from their perspective. But anyway, that was kind of getting on a side tangent, but I agree with Ed about podcasts, especially political podcasts. It can be very repetitive and very annoying. Like, a lot of people think that I just lost there. Steven Crowder is what he's starting to say on his multiple streams a day now, and other things are getting very repetitive. And I know that on the Freedom Scoop live stream, we had a guest on. I can't remember his name right now, but he went on a whole rant towards later on the stream about how he didn't like him, and he didn't like Steven Crowder anymore because he had like people who always laughed at his jokes even if they weren't funny, and he just kept saying the same things, and he just seemed a little more mainstream than he was before. And that is valid criticism, and something I've noticed before with Steven Crowder. But as I was kind of saying with the whole Tiger King thing, and I didn't take notes down on paper, so I don't remember a lot of what they talked about. It's all mental memory, and it was a couple days ago at this point. But I just noticed that what they were saying about government and about politics, and they did a whole episode about President Trump when he got elected and why he was bad for the country and why this shouldn't be allowed and all this other junk. And it made me annoyed enough to where I wanted to talk about it briefly to kind of start and let things roll in this live stream. But then again, it leads to kind of the free speech of the whole thing. And free speech is something I think is greatly important. It's something that America is really unique for, and something that I'm very proud of being American for. And they have a right to say what they said, and I believe that 100%. But the fact that they mentioned politics in the issue and kind of thought of, even though they didn't say it directly, they were basically referring that Joe Exotic was the classic Republican who was pro-guns and against the law and all this other crap. When in reality, yes, he was that. He's not the definition of Republican, even in the state of Florida or wherever else he would have been in. So it was just something that kind of annoyed me a little bit. But they also mentioned other things about like how they didn't think Carol really had killed her husband. And that's up for debate. It's something I don't want to spend a whole episode on Tiger King because there's many other YouTubers that already have. And it's something, again, that doesn't really interest me that much. But the fact that they just had so many stances that I didn't agree with, and they made it more political than it needed to be, made me annoyed. So that's where, and why I thought about it even today, even though I listened to it a couple days ago. And Ed says, but keep in mind, September Reloaded has 337 YouTube subs. Yeah? I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to with that statement, but I know there's a lot of other like political commentators, if you're talking about that. I don't know if I remember him. Was he the one who was on later in the stream about Steven Crowder? I think that was him. Anyway, I just know that he went on like a couple hour-long rant, which was kind of funny, but at least it made it somewhat interesting for later on in the stream. But I decided that I was going to kind of briefly talk about a project I had at school, and I don't want to make this channel all about projects I had at school. That would be rather boring. But this was kind of the second topic I kind of briefly wanted to talk about. And so I had to make a political party. And I thought it would be interesting to kind of discuss what my political party would be and my thoughts of what my party would be. Because it kind of shows a little bit of my stances politically. And although I wouldn't say that I'm fully confident in every stance I have, it's something that I've thought about a lot. And I've recently changed on a couple things. But I thought I would kind of mention like what my party would be within what the assignment was and what I would include. Make this full screen for us here. Or not. Technical difficulties. I'll read Ed's comment here. After we went off the air, he got really drunk and started drawing over Britt's co-host. Yeah, he already seemed like he had a few drinks beforehand. I'll put it that way. I mean, like I said, it was somewhat good for the content of the stream because it was later in the day. And I know that Robert and John were both pretty tired at that point. I don't know why it's not letting me do full screen here. It was earlier, but not anymore. So I'll just have to present it regularly here, unfortunately. And then Ed says, and he continually told us his YouTube sub count. Yeah. Yeah, that's annoying. I only caught in the bare minimum of it because I came later in the day after work, and I know that many of you already heard him talking. And I thought at one point, Ed, you were gonna have him on your channel, but that's probably changed by now, judging on your comments there. But yeah, anybody who kind of rubs in, for the example of YouTube, how many subs they have is rather annoying. And that's something that I've always kind of thought about. Yes, I want my channel to grow, obviously, but I don't want to be one of those YouTubers that's always like, you have to subscribe to me, please, begging eyes and all this other things, because it's not something I really believe in. I would rather gain my subscribers through people who are actually interested in my content and not just people who are persuaded through that to subscribe. I'm not sure if that really made any sense, but so I'll kind of dive into what my topic was and what my political party was. So I had to make a name for my political party, a logo, a party mission statement, and then my platforms on what my party would consist of. And I decided I was going to name my political party the Fort McHenry Party. The Fort McHenry Party. And those who know anything about history might know what the importance of that battle was. I'll kind of briefly talk about it, but I have it on one of the other slides, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But the Fort McHenry Party was a battle against the Brits, obviously after really the American Revolution. But it is where we get our national anthem, our Star Spangled Banner from, as one of the people who wrote the song was on the ship. And it was just kind of an interesting thing, because it's a battle in a fort, and something I'm kind of interested in, as I've been talking about my novel and wanting to make castles what are similar to forts. So I kind of had that in my mind, but it's also, I wanted to kind of have a deeper stance about that's where we got our Star Spangled Banner from. And it says, I don't even ask for a subscription. I would rather send people over to the website where the merch shop is, and the rest of you guys are. Yeah, see, I think I have a similar stance to you, Ed. Like, I know the generational gap, they always kind of subscribe their stuff at the very end, but it's not in a way that's like super artificial. It's not something I would be annoyed at if I just were to stumble on their channel. It's not something they constantly talk about. But there are many other YouTubers who will bring up subscribing at the beginning of their video, the end of their video, and some YouTubers talk about subscribing to talk about wanting to subscribe to you at the beginning, the middle, and the end, and anything else. They just mention it all over. And that's something that's very annoying, and something that I don't really want to do myself. So, originally I was going to have kind of like a battle scene as my logo, but I was kind of looking at the Republican logo, the Democrat logo, the Libertarian logo, and like the Green Party logo, and all these other things. And the political party logos tend to be very simple. And so I was like, well, I don't really want my logo to be extremely complicated. Because then I started thinking from like a money perspective. Because if you keep your logo simple, when you print out your logo in mass, you're able to have it at a cheaper cost. And I don't think that's why the Republican logo is that way, or the Democratic logo is simple. But it's just something that came to my mind as well. I also think that a simple logo, even though it's not as eye-catchy at first, tends to stick in people's mind more than other type of logos. Like, for example, when you think of Democrats, you think of the donkey. It's just something that comes right away. So you want your logo to be like that, especially in politics. So what I had my logo as being was basically a digital drawing of the fort and kind of what it looks like, but has some writing on it, but it's very simple and something I think that would be eye-catching. But it's a little different than everything else what's there, because you have the Libertarian logo, which is simply just the Libertarian letters across. So something very catchy, and you know exactly what it is and what it's for. And I kind of wanted my logo to be like that, but also be something that's just a little more different, so that it sticks in your mind as being different. And as millennials become more in charge, if that makes any sense, I think logos that are just a little bit more complex might become more important. And before you get all mad at me when my next slide or my other slides from now on, originally this was supposed to be presented as it was in Google Slides or PowerPoint or whatever you want to call it. But since we weren't able to present it and she still wanted it in presentation format, I had to write a lot more than what I normally would on the PowerPoint or Google Slide, because as anybody who's been in school recently, or if you have any sort of brains at all, you would know that in PowerPoints are in general supposed to be image-based and not text-based. But since I wasn't able to actually present it, I had to write a lot more words so that you would know what I wanted to have my message come across. Go up. There we go. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, Francis Scott Key was the one who wrote the national anthem during the Battle of Fort McHenry from the ship. And it's something, as I mentioned a little earlier, but I'll say again, was something that would have a little bit of a deeper meaning than just an other name that I could think of or other battle related, because I wanted it to be referenced to something a little bit more stronger, as we'll kind of get to a little bit later in this stream. But I'll read out my party mission statement. America is independent, and the values we have as Americans must be saved. We were founded with the Founding Fathers and the Constitution of the United States and Bill of Rights. These documents have guided values for hundreds of years and must continue. Our party focus is to maintain America's founding policies and independent spirit. So that was my real brief mission statement of my party, and I thought it was very good for kind of showing like what my party stances were going to be, because I think if you had to guess and you weren't able to see what my next part of my stances were, I wanted you to go away with a few things from that mission statement. One, I wanted you to know that I was focused on the Constitution and Bill of Rights. Two, I was focused on what the Founding Fathers believed, which can be related to the Constitution and Bill of Rights, obviously. And three, I wanted to keep the independent spirit of America, or more patriotic spirit that America kind of needs to have more of. Because, as we all know, a lot of Democrats and other people, if that makes any sense, or some Republicans even, are trying to make gun laws stricter. And it's just something that I don't think should ever happen. But at the same time, it seems to be the direction the country is wanting to go. Or at least the media sure makes it seem like it's the direction that they're wanting to make it go. So I don't know if y'all would take that away if you were to read the mission statement like I wanted you to, but I feel like I did a pretty decent job with the mission statement and trying to pass those three messages across. But my first party platform is freedom of speech, or just freedom speech. America's First Amendment and most important, obviously, was more important than most, was most important then and most important still. So what I was kind of saying then was, it was the First Amendment for the Founding Fathers for a reason. It's something they were greatly believed in. It's something they wanted the country to be and to become. And it's something that I think is starting to loosen a little bit in today's times, but it's something I don't think should be loosened in today's times. So it's something I think we should really pass more laws or restrict more laws in allowing Americans to express what they think through their words, because it's freedom of speech. So that's kind of my first viewpoint. Americans have the right to say what they need to say, as I kind of just said. And then I put it has done more good than bad, with examples of Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, FDR, and many other names you can think of from then. So that was kind of my first party platform, was free speech, and basically just emphasizing that more, because I do think that today it's starting to get a little looser than it should be. So this next one is party platform, with being gun rights. And I had to think about this one a little bit, because I know the teacher, and although you could say this wasn't a smart idea to do, but I knew that the teacher was very democratically minded, and I don't exactly want to fail just because of her bias. But I didn't want to change what I had believed and what I think needs to happen for the country to get better, and what if this was my party, the Fort McHenry Party, what it should stand for and what I believe all Americans should have, and that is the right to guns. So I said the Founding Fathers had the right to guns as a Second Amendment. The right to guns is extremely important. As the government gets bigger, the more scary it becomes. And then I put, just as a side note for the teacher, because the rest of this PowerPoint is also going to make her a little upset, but it's something I greatly believe in, especially this next point, and third value that my party would have. But I put universal checks will be passed, but all Americans should have the right to guns as long as they pass. So that's kind of where I mentioned of that universal background checks are, if you believe polls, that many Americans believe should happen, and something that many Americans believe should happen. And I don't particularly know where I stand on universal background checks. I don't think that it's necessarily a super bad idea, but it's also something I need to do more research on to kind of get more of a stance. Because in general, I think that every American has a right to a gun, but at the same time, you don't want guns going to people who don't have the mental state or don't have the ability to be smart with the gun. As I think gun safety should be improved just for the sake of it being better for the average gun owner, because the average gun owner is not going to be someone what uses the gun for bad. And I think that every American has the right to defend themselves with guns, and I want to make that very clear. And I don't think that universal background checks will allow the average gun owner not to have guns, if at all. But it's something that, again, I would feel like I need to do more research on. And if I actually had this party and had to make a stance fully, I don't know exactly where I would stand for now. But it'd be interesting for those who are watching now or later on, what do you think of universal background checks? Because if you believe polls and read a lot of articles about universal background checks, they are very pro universal background checks, and many polls cite that the average American is already for it and has been for it for a while, including Republicans and other members, as you can kind of see in the top right of the PowerPoint slide here. But at the same time, I don't think that universal background checks will really stop the criminals that use guns as bad. But then again, you want your party to kind of seem like you're reducing things. And I think that a good way to seem like they're going to reduce gun violence is by having universal background checks. But at the same time, again, I don't really think that a universal background check is going to stop a bad guy from getting his hands on a gun and using it for bad things. Because there's many other ways you could get guns than the legal route. As Ed says, universal background check is only enforceable with a national firearm registry, which is a real slippery slope. That's the thing I've heard. That's the thing I've heard a lot from like Matt Christensen on his channel, because he is very, very, very pro Second Amendment and believes every American should have the right to guns and should own guns. But at the same time, it's kind of like the red flag laws and other things related to guns. And again, as I kind of already said, it's something I do need to do more research with of guns, because it's I believe every American, as I've already said about 5 times now, should have the right to guns. But at the same time, I don't really know if there's any measure you could do to stop guns from getting into bad people's hands, even if you were to do a universal background check. Because that's kind of Ed referred to, that the only way a universal background checks work is if you have a registry. And having a registry is a very slippery slope and therefore makes the government much bigger. And I would prefer that the government were to stay out of it than to be more involved with it. As Ron Helton, and hey Ron, says no background checks are an infringement. The government should not determine ownership of a firearm. Ever look up the loons? Then there is no need for the background checks. And then Ed replied, I understand the merit to it and the selling points, but I also know the mechanics of it. Ron says, everyone has the right to self-defense. Again, I agree 100% that everybody has the right to self-defense. And I do think that guns should be allowed for every American to get more than they shouldn't be allowed for Americans to get. So in other words, I think that looser gun laws should be the way to go, but at the same time, you don't want to just have an open door so that guns end up getting used more for harm. But my third point was a pro-life stance. As you probably know, I'm Catholic and Christian. So the stance of pro-life is something that I hold very important. And I do think that abortion is very bad. And the only case that I really agree that abortion can be just, and even it's up to the decision of the families as a whole, is the case of rape and the case of it might be killing the mother, which happens, I believe, less than 3%, if I remember right, of the cases of abortion, even though that probably was an older statistic at this point. But as I've said kind of on my second point there, abortion when the mother could die or has been raped would be allowed, just as a general stance, because I think that everybody agrees that, well, maybe not everybody, you have the hardcore religious or the hardcore stances of people who say that abortion shouldn't be allowed ever, but I do think that that's a very hard stance to take as a party. So I kind of was like, well, I think that abortion should be allowed because I think everybody agrees on abortion if it were to kill the mother or if they had been raped. But I also was talking about later and more exclusively, it's something that I've kind of looked into a lot, and I'm thinking about doing a whole live stream about in a couple of weeks probably when I have a little bit more time to kind of put all the research together. But that's the path to adoption, because adoption is a very long and complex process, and I'm not saying that it should be a lot shorter, because the way adoption is done is very important so that the child ends up in the right house, regardless of what age the child is. And especially overseas adoption is very difficult, but I do think that improving adoption and making adoption easier but still safe is an important way to allow mothers who are on the fence about whether they want to keep the baby or not to decide to adopt more than decide to kill. Because I do think that in general, the average parent who is willing to adopt is doing it for the right reasons than the average parent who is doing it for the wrong reasons. And Ed said, referring to guns, red flag laws are a bypass of due process. Once again, the mechanics are bad, but it's wrapped in a really pretty package. And Ron said, there is no qualifier statement in the Second Amendment. The government is not to be in charge of property rights. An armed society is a polite society. And I think Ed and Ron have both valid points, because I want to make the statement very clear about guns. I do think that the average American has the right to the gun, and gun laws should be allowed and written in such a way that the average American does have a gun, because the right to self-defense is very valid. And I think the average American is very much like my dad. The average American, I think, owns a gun, but isn't necessarily going to take that gun to a gun range or show his gun to his friends every other weekend or whatever the case might be. It's someone that has a gun for self-defense reasons, but doesn't necessarily flash it all around. He knows where it is, I know where it is, my mom knows where it is, and my brother knows where it is. But we're not exactly going to gun ranges or showing it or doing anything really with it unless we absolutely need it. And I think the average American owns guns for that reason. They don't own it to flash it around. I felt like I repeated myself a little bit there, but I wanted to make my point very clear. I think the average American wants a gun, and guns should be allowed for Americans because they want it for self-defense just in case it were to happen. But the just in case is still there. So it's something that is very valid, and it's something I think every American should really have. And then my fourth platform was overseas support issue. And what I kind of meant by this was, one, I wanted to end overseas involvement with national and being the ward cop, because the U.S. is very much known for being kind of the ward police or the ward cop, and wanting to go into other countries and tell them how to do something, when in reality we're not really helping. In most cases, we're actually hurting more than helping. But we also have a very, 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 very times 100 long war overseas, and the history of pulling troops back before it's needed is very low, and the history of keeping troops too long is very high. And I do think that it's time to bring the troops back and to basically end not all conversation with the war, but to end most conversation with it. It's time to take care of ourselves and to solve our own issues before we keep helping and making the situation worse overseas. As I kind of said, troops have been employed overseas for way too long. It's time to pull them back home. Our party would push to bring everyone back home through the House of Congress. The U.S. should take care of itself first before babysitting the rest of the world, as I kind of already said. And I think from the general stance of Ed, and probably Ron as well, just from when I've listened to, or not really listened, but read his comments on Ed's stream, or Steven's stream, or the generational gap, as I think he would agree on this as well. But I think we both agree that our overseas involvement, especially with troops, is something that we have done for way too long, and those troops deserve the right to come back home, and we shouldn't really be involved in these super long wars just for the sake of being involved in it. And you could say it's for oil money, or for money, for whatever reason you can come up with, but the reason you can come up with isn't worth the cost of what it is. War is very expensive. As Ron says, there will always be someone who loses it and goes on a killing spree, like that denture maker in Canada the other day. Wouldn't it be better that everyone have a weapon than no weapon for that? All wars are bankers' wars. Again, I agree. And referring back to Ron's first point there is, I think the right for every owner to have a gun is better than nobody having a gun, or less people having a gun, because there is always the case where if someone else had a gun, there would be better results from it. Like in the case of the college shootings where you had like that one Marine, I think it was in Michigan. Don't quote me on that, but where he basically tackled the shooter and saved a whole bunch of people's lives. Yes, he didn't have a gun, but he was able to save the day. And I think if the average American has a gun, the average person like my father who has a gun isn't going to use that gun for bad, and is going to keep it for self-defense and for just in case type of moments. And just because there's more guns out there doesn't mean that guns are going to be used for bad. It's such a stupid argument for when people say that guns are the bad things. Guns have nothing to do with anything. It's the people behind the trigger what have to do with it. So if you really want to prove the people behind the trigger, you either don't let people into the country who are terrorists, or you have more mental health through not necessarily drugs, because nope. I don't like that angle of antidepressants and other things like that, because I've done somewhat a lot of research on it. Depression is a very, very tough subject, and it's a reason why when I first started my YouTube channel for the school project, I made a whole video on mental health. And originally I was going to do an entire series on mental health. I'm getting on a little side tangent here, but it's something I still kind of plan to do. And once I figure out how to have interviews and things like that, I actually plan to have interviews with people who either had these depression moments or bipolar or other things like that. But also I want to get on experts of the situation, because I do think that opioids, even though that's related to pain and not necessarily depression, but I don't think that drugs are necessarily the best route to go. As my fifth platform is more state control. And this is one I thought about for a while, because I was thinking at first, well, there's a lot of state governors, like for example in California, that's it. In like California or Michigan, Man, the Michigan one. Whew. I don't want to get corona related at all here, so I'm not really going to mention it, even though I just did. But man, she is crazy. Anyway, so I was thinking, like, do I really want to include these situations of more state control? But at the same part, I'm like, I think that as a belief, I think that states know themselves better than the mass government knows itself. So I said the states need to have more control. The government has gotten too big. Allowing the states more freedom is what the founding fathers wanted. In general, the states know more about its people than one governing body. This will be done by reducing the government size. Because in general, on all my party stances and my main party topic was having government become less by reducing its size. Because I do think that a smaller government is better in almost every way. And that's something I very much believe. And I do, in general, think that the states know themselves better than the mass of people or the mass government and one Congress body or one House body or whatever them combined. Local governments tend to know their situations better. And they may not be as qualified, but I think that the qualified politician isn't someone you should necessarily trust either. Nancy Pelosi. Woo. Okay. As Ron says, there is no authority in the Constitution for the government to have offensive wars against other countries, only defensive. There was no need to invade Afghanistan and definitely zero need for Iraq. And then Ed replied, yes, there was. W had to complete Daddy's legacy. Oh, Daddy, are you proud of me yet? Oh, man. But yeah, I mean, I live in Texas, right? And I had a cousin who I believe was in Afghanistan when he was in the army. And he was on, not necessarily the bomb squad, but he was associated with it. And I don't know the exact term from it. I know he's told me this story before, or the family this story before. But essentially he didn't get, luckily, but they got attacked by a bomb. And many of the members and close friends that he had died from it, and many others got injured. Luckily, he was perfectly safe, but it's really scarred him and made him a really different type of person. So war affects a lot of people who join it, and a lot of people join the army or join whatever branch of the military at a young age, compared to a lot of older age members, because in general you want younger, so that over the years your average age stays young and more athletic and more fit to do things, obviously, especially if you're overseas. So I do think that overseas wars, as Ron said, were completely pointless and something that should have never ever been done. And it's something that has affected many people's lives, especially here in Texas, what generally tends to be very pro-military type of state. And I know a lot of people and friends have had either family members in the military or themselves have been in the military and other things like that. I work at a grocery store and I see somebody in an Army shirt, a Navy shirt, some military branch shirt, almost every other like fifth customer, or somebody who has been in one of those branches of the Army. So it's something that is very, very big within the state of Texas. And we're going back to kind of my fourth party stance of being overseas conflict and not really state control. But I do think that there should be more limits on how that happens, because the troops are ready to come home, and really they should come home, and there's really no reason that they shouldn't be here already. Trump ran on the platform of bringing them home, and I do think that this COVID-19 stuff is not making it any easier to bring the troops back home compared to what it was beforehand. My last stance, I believe this was my last party platform, as we are only allowed 6, was term limits. But before I dive in, I'll kind of read Ron's comment. It is being sarcastic low. Bush Senator getting us involved in the first Gulf War blunder is how we got attacked and started Gulf War, blunder 2. Just follow the Constitution and keep us out of the affairs of other countries. Yeah, I know he was being sarcastic. I was just playing with him. Ron is very much, or not Ron, Ed is very much that way of being sarcastic, but I like it for him, so that's good. So party platform number 6 was term limits, and it says the founding fathers believed in term limits. George Washington could have had more term limits. That was kind of a fun fact I kind of threw in as a point. But a lot of people, even though they just came from a king and went away from a monarchy, George Washington very likely could have become a king with going more than 2 term limits that he's chose on. But he didn't. So he kind of set the president or the concept of term limits from then on. And presidents didn't really go as many until FDR, but that was for other reasons. And I think in general, people tend to think that what FDR did was valid. Term limits for every phase of the government would allow less corruption. And I basically included some concepts of it, like the House, the Senate, judges, Supreme judges, and all government spots, including local. And I know that some spots, like senators and things, already have term limits, but I'm more talking about either reduced term limits or setting term limits such as Supreme judges so that they don't grow old and unmental in order to serve their sentence out. Because you have the classic case of I can never say your name. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or Ginsburg himself, who has become very ill in the past. And it's just kind of sad to see somebody, because at one point she was very prominent and very huge, become kind of so weak within a stance. So I think by having term limits for Supreme judges, they may be a lot longer than other type of government positions, because in general you want consistency there. And they have been longer sentences. So even if you want to keep long and say like 12 years as a term limit, it's still better than allowing for life, where many things, including mental health, can come into hand. And Jimmy Carbajal, hey Jimmy, says, yo, can you send me a roundtable shirt? Yeah, if you're willing to pay like $35. They were pretty expensive when I made it, but I just wanted to have one. And I normally have it for a stream, and I believe I wore this shirt under it, just because I don't want to get the white shirt dirty. I don't know exactly why. I made it white for that, but oh well. So this kind of brings me to the main part of stop. Okay. This kind of brings me to the main part of my stream, or at least when I wanted to talk about for a little bit till we end. And the main topic of the title, which is who will be Joe's VP, and I put and more. Even though I spent a lot longer of time talking about these other topics than I planned to, but I've enjoyed it so far. So I might not be able to go as long for this main portion or what I wanted to talk about. But I was more going to kind of ask the comment section who you think is going to be Joe's vice president. Because before I started this stream, and before I kind of asked on Twitter about kind of like topics that I could have for my live stream, and Ed and many others started talking about ideas for it. I was thinking, like, what do I kind of want to talk about? And this idea came up, and I was like, okay. So I started taking some brief research. So I kind of wanted to talk about my process and who I think is going to be Joe's VP. And Ed says, we will have to get some in the merch shop. Jimmy says, hell no. Ed says, I think we can get some for lower. Let me talk to the bag man. Yeah, of course. Well, I would love to have a t-shirt design and Freedom Scoop. And by the way, you should check out freedomscoop.com. That's where you'll have Ed, and you have the Generational Gap and Steven. And now we have several other members like R-Rated Conservative. And I think Freckled Libertarian, if I'm remembering right, is now a member of Freedom Scoop. And you have several others as well, but it's a very good group of people, and I would highly suggest checking their channels out through Freedom Scoop. And that's where he was talking to the main dude of Freedom Scoop. Well, one of the main dudes of Freedom Scoop to get that t-shirt. And like I already said, that would be really awesome. But kind of going back to Joe's VP. So I was just thinking throughout the day, and I don't necessarily know. Excuse me. I don't necessarily know what the mass media is saying, because in general, I've tried staying away from news, because news has really kind of drawn me down, and I just haven't been. I've noticed that when I listen to news or read news, that I've become more angry or more depressed with it, because news in general is just very one-sided and very just annoying, especially with it all being COVID related. Not that COVID is not an issue we should be concerned about, but it's something that doesn't need to have as much attention as it's had, because it's just constant COVID news, and it's just something I'm tired of reading about, because even if I try looking at something that's not COVID related, I end up reading 6 articles about COVID, and it all kind of says the same thing. So I kind of stayed away from what the news now is saying about who might be Joe's VP. So I'm kind of going into this blind, which I think will be rather interesting to kind of learn my perspective on who I think might be Joe's VP without really looking at who he might have talked about or what the mass media thinks his vice president may be. And I know that the generational gap, and probably Ed on one of his morning episodes probably talked about who might be Joe's VP at some point, but I haven't really got the chance to listen to those either, unfortunately. And Ed, just real quick before I dive in, says Freckles and Britt are new members. Awesome, yeah. We had Britt on that long 12-hour Freedom Scoop stream, the charity stream, a couple weeks ago now, and that's awesome to hear that she's part of it too. I thought I remember you telling me that, but anyway, it's awesome. So yeah, I was kind of just thinking, and that kind of brought me to the process, and I started thinking about who was kind of the talk a couple of months ago, even really before this COVID stuff hit the news. And I was like, well, Kamala Harris, because she kind of hits a few type of viewpoints that I think Joe Biden's kind of wanting to have within the Democratic Party. You have a woman of color. Well, that's two things: a woman and a woman of color. And you also have someone a little bit more progressive than Joe Biden, who's kind of more of that middle of a road type of Democrat compared to like a Bernie Sanders especially. Then I was thinking, well, I'm not so sure about Kamala Harris anymore. I don't think that she kind of lost any steam she would have had going into things. So then I started thinking, well, who might it be now? And I remember watching a YouTuber who was kind of talking about who might be Joe Biden's vice president, and he kind of was mentioning that it seemed like the way Elizabeth Warren kind of randomly stepped out, but just stayed long enough to not let Bernie Sanders win as many delegates as he could have, made it seem a little suspicious, especially since I believe she dropped out either the day of or the day before one of the voting of the states, that she thought she might have talked directly to Joe Biden's campaign and agreed to be his vice president. And I was thinking, well, does Elizabeth Warren with Joe Biden make sense? And I was thinking a little bit about that, and I was thinking, okay, well, it makes sense on a couple of different things. You'll have the progressive angle, which I do think that the Democratic Party, the DNC, is really wanting to push on, because I think that the Democrats are very decided that they want someone who is politically inclined more to get their progressive type of college and younger type of voter, while Joe Biden gets more of the older, set in their ways type of Democratic voter person. So I was thinking, well, Warren definitely covers the progressive angle of the party, and Joe gets more the middle of the ground. She also covers being a woman, because I do think that the DNC in general, although it makes me annoyed to say it, that the fact of having a woman as vice president is something that has to be talked about as much as it has to, because it should be voted on the person that has the most qualifications and the most the person what's most fit to be vice president. And then just because that person's a woman doesn't make them any less. I want to make that very, very clear. I think that the fact that she's a woman shouldn't add anything than the fact that if she were to be a man or whatever vice versa scenario, they should be at even level. Just because they're a different gender doesn't set anyone at an advantage to the other. That's the way it should be, and that's the way it has to be when you're talking about politics. So the fact that the DNC seems to be wanting to push a woman candidate and saying, oh, she's a woman, that's why you should vote for her. Woman, 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 woman. I don't think that the average Joe American citizen is thinking that just because she's a woman or just because it's a woman, I'm going to vote for her because of that. I don't think that there's enough of that going around to really push a candidate. But could Warren, as the vice president, kind of draw up that general stance? Because as I kind of say that, I remember that I was in government class, although it's online now, and that's why I say as I remember, she was in government class. Anyway, there was a lot of people, it seemed to be, there was one guy who I vividly remember saying that if there were more women in the government, it would be nicer and we would get more things done. And although I can't necessarily disagree with that statement, it's just a rather weird statement to say to me, because I think that the most qualified people should be in politics, and I don't think that that's always that way, because I've kind of always said, especially with a president, you have to be someone what is full of himself and very egotistical to want to be a president and want to be the spokesperson of an entire nation, especially a nation like the United States. And I remember that Matt Christensen and Blonde on their Sunday stream, I believe 2 weeks ago, talked about how the type of woman presidency attracts are not the type of woman you would necessarily want to be around. It's the type of woman that's very egotistical and very bullish, because it's someone who has to be in with a lot of men and be able to have their way with them, and not in but to have their way with them through their words and through their actions and other things. So it attracts very much people like Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren. Amy Klobuchar wasn't really that type, but she didn't really get as far. Even though Kamala Harris exited before Amy Klobuchar, I would argue that Kamala Harris got more attention than really Amy Klobuchar did. She was just able to kind of be middle of the road for the entire time. And Jimmy says, I say Warren. Ed says, smart money's on Whitmore. I think I said that right. Jimmy says, she was the last to drop out after seeing that both Bernie and Obama endorse Biden. Ron says, if it happens to be a woman, then okay. But you're right, a person's sex should not be the reason to pick somebody. I would rather we just shut down this criminal enterprise called government at the local, state, and federal level. It is absolutely corrupt. And then Jimmy says, who did you vote for? Who did I vote? I didn't vote with this last midterm, which sounds a little weird. Actually, I did. Yeah, I did vote, actually. I remember that now. I was being like, wait a second. Yeah, I did. What? I didn't vote for a Democrat, Jimmy, but if I were to vote for a Democrat at the time, I would have probably picked Joe at that point, even though we talked in person before all this college stuff got shut down, Jimmy, but I would probably have put my money on Andrew Yang if I were to pick any Democratic candidate, just because I tend to have more trust in his type of campaign than other types. Like the last person I would have voted for on policy-wise would have been Bernie Sanders, and the last person I would have voted for personally-wise would have been Elizabeth Warren. I cannot stand Elizabeth Warren, but at the same time, I think on a general mass media sense, I could see Elizabeth Warren being the candidate for Joe Biden's vice presidency. And Ed was saying that his money's on Whitmore, but I don't really know too much about Whitmore, to be honest. I remember that I asked John on his junk stream what he thought might be the vice president. And I know he didn't want to get political, but I wasn't able to catch what he said on his channel, and that's why I asked. And he was thinking that I was going to be Whitmore as well. At least briefly, he was mentioning that. And he said that you brought up a good point, but I wasn't able to hear what your point was. And then Ed says, I was going to vote for Sanders, just watch the ward burn. Wisconsin was the last state to have a real primary. I looked at the bubble, though. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I did wind up voting Tulsi. Yeah, I do think that Tulsi has a lot of generic appeal, especially the way I think about it is I don't think Trump is necessarily super popular within Republican candidates as a whole. Trump definitely has this cult level following, or you don't necessarily have to call it a cult, but he has a following that's very big, and you have kind of the stereotype of a massive F-1000, giant truck with the Trump flag from the back hanging and flying out with these big wheels and other, characteristics, especially in Texas. I tend to think of that stereotype. And I actually have seen one of those trucks as a side note, and I couldn't help but to laugh a little bit because it fit that stereotype or that kind of viewpoint of who Trump supporters are. They're gun-willing, truck-owning, blah, 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 old, whatever. But as a quick other side note before I get back into kind of my main perspective or main point, was that the people who are at least proud to say that they're Trump supporters and not necessarily hiding it for the sake of their life or whatever this drastic scenario might be, tend to actually be older gentlemen. At least at the grocery store I work for, the people who are wearing these MAGA hats or Trump hats in general tend to be older men and tend to be like Army veterans or other things in that perspective. So that's rather interesting and something I've thought about for a little bit because Trump might have more of the older population than a lot of people think. But as I was kind of going to talk about for the main perspective and what Ed said about voting for Tulsi, was that I do think that the average Republican isn't necessarily a super huge Trump supporter. I think they have liked Trump for a lot of reasons, such as really exposing the media for who they are and other variables like that. But I do think that the average Republican sees a lot of appeal in Tulsi, and I do think she gets a lot of cross support because she has a very big stance on her war efforts, and that's really kind of the big thing she's known for, and she's really pushed wanting to pull troops back home, and that's something she believes in 100% and something I believe in 100%, as it was one of my party stances. And I'll just read what Ed said because I think he was mentioning Whitmore, and I don't really know too much about Whitmore, to be honest. As it said, think about Whitmore for a second. No one had heard of that woman until she gave the SOTU rebuttal, and she didn't at the same time really have a platform to do so. Jimmy says, as a liberal with the Democratic views, I voted for Bernie for one particular reason. Bernie stated he would give free institutional money for college students. That was the only reason I probably wouldn't have voted. And then Edgar says, she's been a governor for exactly 5 seconds. Inaugurated in January of 2019 and has been in news every day since the lockdown started. So you seem to think that Whitmore is getting a lot of mass media support, and therefore the DNC or mass media in general tend to kind of want to push Whitmore out to have Joe Biden pick her. And she's still a woman, so that fits the DNC part of having a woman perspective for vice president, because I do think that is going to happen. If it's not Whitmore, if it's not Kamala Harris, if it's not Elizabeth Warren, if it's not Amy Klobuchar, if it's not any of these other women, I would be very shocked if the vice president were to end up being a man, because everywhere I've heard and talked about, and the general stance of what mass media seems to believe and what commentators on YouTube seem to believe, is that the vice president is going to be a woman. It's just a matter of who gets it. And I was just reading over Jimmy's comment again about voting for Bernie for his free institutional money for college students. I do think that that's why Bernie, or I do think, I should say I could know at this point, that's why Bernie has a lot of support with the younger Democratic population and really younger population in general. The average American doesn't really follow politics like a lot of people do. Like, I know, Jimmy, you follow politics generally well. I follow politics generally well. I know Ed follows politics well. I know Ron follows politics well. And a lot of other people follow politics well. But I do think the average, especially younger American like us, Jimmy, don't really follow politics as much. And really just kind of go with the flow because they're worried about passing classes or doing fun things and not really wanting to bog themselves down with news and other mediums like that. But I know that Bernie Sanders has a lot of big following from younger because of his promise for free college and free institutional money, as you quoted. And that's something that, as a viewpoint, I'm very, very worrisome of anything that has free in it because it's going to have to come from somewhere. That was the whole thing about when Trump wanted to pass these stimulus checks. A lot of Republicans, mainly, and hardcore Republicans, were worried about where this money is coming from. And I believe Ed, on one of his contemporaries, and you can quote me if I'm wrong, didn't want to take his stimulus check because he didn't know where the money was coming from. And it's something that worried Ed more than I think the average American really would be worried for, because Ed didn't really want to put America back. And I'm using Ed because he's not here and he's not able to say it verbally himself, and I would encourage checking his episode where he talked about it, and this is off of memory. So again, say anything if I'm wrong or say anything if I'm right if you're still here, Ed. But that was something that was very important for him, because free anything and money just to print out and deflates the value and other things. It's very, let's just say, debt is a very interesting concept because America and the U.S. is very high in debt, but at the same time, we don't really seem too worried about it. And I know that a lot of nations are in debt as well. So that's kind of the bad thing. The only way we're able to get money since we're in debt is to print more money. And by printing more money, that deflates the value of the money we already have. And I was worried with Bernie that if he were to pass out all these free stuff, just taking his example of college and free institutional money, they would have to print it from somewhere, and he didn't really exactly say where that money would come from. And that only includes his free college, and it didn't include his health care and many other free stances he wanted to take from it. And Ed says, I know where the money is coming from, thin air. That's kind of like what I'm saying. The only way you're going to get this money is by printing it. And where are you printing it from? Nowhere. You're just printing it from nowhere, and therefore that deflates the value that the money gets held at. Money is a very almost abstract concept because it has a exchange rate to it and it has a rate for it. So the more you print and the less you spend, the money gets deflated. And I don't know a whole bunch about economics, but I know that you can't just start printing money out from nowhere and expect that it'll be better in the long run. If that was the case, you would just print money nonstop and everybody would be rich, but that's not the way it works. So kind of going back to who might be the vice president, I think right now if I were to choose somebody, even though it kind of seems generic, and I don't know too much about Whitmore, and I kind of want to look at Whitmore a little bit more to talk about later on to have more of a knowledge base from what Ed is saying, or just listen to Ed's contemporaries more, was the fact that I do think that Elizabeth Warren is going to end up being the vice president, because I do think that the DNC and Joe Biden for his main ticket is going to want somebody who's a little more progressive and most definitely a woman. And then Ed says, more than my future wife does about economics. Yeah, well, I don't really know what to say about that one. I don't know if Jimmy's still here, but that's kind of the whole thing I think about there. So I think Jimmy said that it was going to be Elizabeth Warren, and I think he probably still thinks that. And I know that we talked about all this Democratic debates when they were a thing. But yeah, I just think that Elizabeth Warren's going to end up being the vice president under Joe Biden. And I'll be interested looking more at Whitmore and seeing what that's going to come from. But I was also thinking from a general stance, like let's say the other ticket still has Mike Pence, which I do think is highly likely. I do think that the Republican ticket is going to have a returning president of Donald Trump and a returning vice president of Mike Pence. And thank you, Jimmy. Preach better. And just as a side note, whenever this coronavirus stuff goes away, we should be able to have a video before I move to the college together, Jamie. I do plan to do that. I'm not ignoring you on that one. To have a joint video, and we could talk about maybe the presidential race whenever it gets a little bit closer, because at that point the coronavirus might be gone. Fingers crossed. So I would like to still do a collaboration with you, so don't think that I'm ignoring you there. I just can't really do it right now. And also, as a side note to all that, and Jimmy might understand this, I had a math test earlier today, and I actually did a pretty good job with it, so I'm rather happy about it. And this isn't anything related to what we were just talking about, but it came to mind. And I was just thinking about the online stuff in college, and Jimmy, if you're still here, you could kind of answer that. And I'll kind of end with this topic, as I have to mow the grass soon. I didn't want to do it in the heat, but anyway, was about how college has gone online. And I know for myself, I had an online class before, but college online isn't really the same as a whole. And it makes it a lot trickier, especially because the college I go to and the college I go to isn't really super good about keeping everything super organized. It's all up to the teacher, and the teachers are all very different. And the way the teachers do things is different, as I've kind of just said. But it makes it very tricky to kind of have a stance. When you actually go physically to class and see a teacher, it's much easier because you just have that physical contact. And I do think that that's generally because people are very much socially interactive with each other and get a lot of social vibes, so to speak. And being in a class is very much a good way of doing that. But at the same time, online can be effective. I do have a teacher or professor that is effective with online college, and I feel rather good. And he has live seminars, kind of like a Zoom conference you can tune into to watch his class and other things like that. So I seem very connected with his class. But it's hard at a college level because professors get more freedom to be able to have a consistency like a high school might have with their homework and with their information with college. So it's just something I'm trying to get used to, and something that's been taking a lot of time, and hopefully I'll get a little bit better at it as a whole side note to end with. So yeah, I just lost my train of thought there. So I got like 2 more minutes before I have to end here. So just kind of, even though I talked about it a little bit earlier in my stream, that I don't really particularly like to say, hey, subscribe, make sure you like the video, blah, blah, blah. Because as Ed kind of said earlier, I would rather hit the website of Freedom Scoop. Again, you should check out freedomscoop.com. And whenever I end this live stream here and finish the lawn outside, I'll be able to put the links and all the other stuff in the description of this video for anyone who tunes in later or finds it after this video ends. And thank you, Jimmy and Ron and Ed, and for being on this live stream. It does help to have comments and to have people who are actually watching live, because it helps it flow, and I appreciate y'all very much. And I feel like it made it a whole lot more fun for me, and hopefully a whole lot more fun for you as well. But again, even though I don't really like to say it, I would appreciate it if you were to subscribe and like the video if you haven't already. I think that there's already 4 likes and 5 people watching, so I think everyone's already done that. So I appreciate that very much. And again, I hope you'll check out my videos later, or my live stream later. I still plan on doing my book stream. I think that's going to change to Tuesday because I have a couple of online conference calls with the college I'm going to be transferring to on Monday. So I plan to do my live stream on Tuesday, and I'll have a couple of other videos, 2 of them to release next week if all goes well. And I have a video about psychology and a video about a little bit of history. And I'll probably have a news video sprinkled sometime in next week if all goes well and I'm able to get everything done. Hopefully this online college gets a little easier and I'll be able to make a little bit more content. But I would appreciate if you were to give this video a like, as I've already said. And again, just one more time, I want to thank Jimmy, Ed, and Ron for catching the stream. You made it a lot more fun, and I appreciate y'all. And thank you very much, and catch you next time.